I stepped onto the stage as valedictorian, the auditorium roaring, but the two seats reserved for my parents remained entirely empty. Across town, they were toasting my sister Mallory's lavish grand opening. That night, a text read, "Sorry, her party cannot be ruined. You understand." 7 years later, seeing my luxury loft online, they suddenly remembered they had another daughter. But at our staged reunion dinner, they were not asking for money. They were begging for my silence. My name is Leah Davis. At 22 years old, I stood in the humid, pulsating wings of the Lakeview State University auditorium, clutching the damp hem of my dark graduation gown. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and nervous, buzzing energy, vibrating with the deafening applause of thousands of proud parents. When the dean leaned into the microphone and called my name, adding the prestigious summa cum laude distinction, I stepped out from the shadows and into the blinding heat of the stage spotlight. I did not look at the dean as he handed me my diploma cover. I did not look at the flashing cameras from the university press. My eyes, trained by years of quiet observation, locked immediately onto row G, seats 12 and 13. They were empty. Two dark velvet voids sitting right in the middle of a vibrant sea of cheering families, holding bouquets and painted signs. Those empty chairs felt less like a simple absence and more like a silent, heavy gavel coming down on my entire existence. They were a physical manifestation of a truth I had spent my whole life trying to outrun. Growing up in the quiet, suffocating town of Belmere, Missouri, I had learned early on how to take up as little space as possible. I was the daughter who ran on sheer grit and absolute silence. I funded my own existence because I had to. While my peers spent their weekends at football games or lake parties, I worked grueling graveyard shifts at the local 24-hour convenience store. From 10 at night until 6 in the morning, I swept up sticky, spilled slushies, restocked heavy glass bottles in the freezing coolers, and rang up stale cigarettes for weary truck drivers. I would return home smelling of cheap coffee and bleach, just in time to shower and head to high school. I hunted down academic grants and scholarships like a starving animal tracking prey. I never asked for a dime from my parents, and more importantly, I never asked for their applause. That role, the role of the beloved, shining star, was entirely monopolized by my older sister, Mallory Davis. Mallory was 3 years older, breathtakingly photogenic, and possessed an effortless, magnetic social grace that our mother, Evelyn Davis, absolutely worshipped. To Evelyn, Mallory was not just a daughter, she was an extension of her own ego, the beautiful face of the family. Mallory was the centerpiece of every holiday dinner, the star of every bloated photo album, the protagonist of every exaggerated story my mother told to anyone who would listen at the grocery store or the hair salon. My childhood was meticulously measured in the tiny, sharp stings of displacement. A straight-A report card I proudly brought home would briefly make it to the refrigerator door, only to be quietly and seamlessly taken down 2 days later to make room for a glossy, oversized poster of Mallory's spring theater production. My birthdays, which inconveniently fell near Mallory's half-birthday, were almost always combined into one event where I blew out candles on a cake that had Mallory's favorite flavor. Meanwhile, every single one of my sister's victories, a cheerleading captaincy, a local pageant runner-up title, even just securing a wealthy new boyfriend was heralded with 3-tiered cakes, imported floral arrangements, a house packed full of guests, and tearful, glowing paragraphs posted all over social media. But this time, I thought things would be different. I had secured a 100% full-ride scholarship to study financial analysis, maintaining a perfect 4.0 grade point average for 4 consecutive years. I had survived advanced calculus, brutal internship hours, and relentless fatigue. Graduation was supposed to be the indisputable, undeniable proof that I mattered. It was the first monumental milestone in my life that I genuinely, perhaps foolishly, believed my parents could not possibly ignore. Evelyn and my father, Grant Davis, had promised they would be there. They had looked me in the eye and promised. My father had even patted my shoulder a month prior. swearing they had secured seats in the very front section so they could get the best angle for photographs. Yet, as fate, or perhaps just the undeniable, cruel pattern of my life would have it, that exact same weekend marked the grand opening of Mallory's newest, most expensive venture, Goldfinch Gatherings. It was an overly ambitious, luxury event planning studio, built on aesthetic perfection, velvet drapes, and an alarming amount of startup capital that I knew my parents could barely afford to help her with. Standing on that stage, clutching a leather binder that contained the validation of 4 years of extreme sleep deprivation and relentless discipline, the silence from those 2 empty seats roared in my ears louder than the thousands of clapping hands. I walked off the opposite side of the stage, handed my rental gown back to the university coordinator, and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. I sat alone in my beat-up second-hand sedan in the sprawling campus parking lot. Through the dusty windshield, I watched other families swarming the green lawns, popping expensive champagne, hugging their children, and taking endless, joyful photographs. I sat in the suffocating heat of the car, watching the digital dashboard clock tick away the minutes of what was supposed to be my proudest day. At exactly 6:15 in the evening, my phone buzzed against the center console. It was a single, brief text message from Evelyn. It did not say congratulations. It did not express regret. It simply read, "Mallory needs us more right now." You understand. I did not cry. I think the physical capacity for tears had been slowly, methodically drained out of me over 22 years of being perpetually second best. A few days later, I drove the 3 long hours back down the interstate to Belmere to pack the last of my childhood belongings. When I pushed open the heavy front door of our family home, the remnants of Goldfinch Gatherings' spectacular triumph were scattered everywhere, mocking me. Thick, expensive satin ribbons in blush and gold hung lazily from the oak staircase banister. Massive, wilting arrangements of white hydrangeas and pale pink roses suffocated the living room, leaving a sweet, rotting scent hanging heavy in the stagnant air. Empty crystal champagne flutes still sat on the coffee table. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen island, casually flipping through a glossy home decor catalog, a cup of expensive tea resting beside her. My father, Grant, was standing by the sink, silently washing a single coffee mug over and over again. Neither of them rushed to hug me. Evelyn barely looked up when I walked in holding my heavy, glass-framed degree in my arms. When I finally broke the silence, my voice steady but cold, asking her how she could possibly justify skipping the only college graduation her family would likely ever see, her face hardened immediately. It shifted effortlessly into that familiar, dismissive mask she wore whenever I demanded basic equity. She sighed loudly, turning a page of her catalog as if my very presence was a minor, irritating inconvenience she had to manage. "A grand opening only happens once," she said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth or maternal affection. "You are smart, you are independent, you will have plenty of other achievements later." Mallory needed the emotional support to get this business off the ground. She needed her family today. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw the utter, terrifying emptiness in her justification. She did not feel guilty. She did not feel a shred of remorse. She only felt deeply annoyed that I was standing there, demanding a tiny fraction of the spotlight she had permanently, exclusively reserved for Mallory. I glanced at my father. Grant kept his eyes glued to the soap suds in the sink, offering nothing but his trademark, cowardly silence. He chose the path of least resistance, just as he always did. I did not scream. I did not throw the framed degree on the floor to shatter the glass. I simply turned around, walked up the narrow stairs to my cramped, unadorned bedroom, and packed exactly 2 canvas duffel bags. I did not take any framed family photos. I did not take the worn childhood trinkets sitting on my dresser. I only took my practical clothes, my hard-earned degree, the printed graduation program with my name highlighted on it, and the few $100s I had saved from the graveyard shifts at the convenience store. I walked back down the stairs, past the rotting roses, past my silent father, past my mother who did not even turn her head to watch me leave. I left Belmere that exact same night. Driving past the rusted city limit sign under the pitch-black, starless Missouri sky, my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. As the town faded into the rearview mirror, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to the empty stretch of highway ahead. I was completely, irrevocably done. I would never, as long as I lived, beg anyone to love me ever again. The transition to Minneapolis, Minnesota, was not a grand adventure. It was an act of raw survival. I rented a tiny, drafty studio apartment in a neighborhood where the freezing winds howling off the Mississippi River seemed to cut straight through the thin brick walls. The space smelled permanently of old radiator iron and the cheap lemon cleaner the landlord used to mask the scent of previous tenants. I owned a mattress on the floor, a single wobbly thrift store table, and a laptop. That was the entirety of my kingdom. I landed an entry-level position at North Glass Risk Advisory, a mid-sized, highly competitive financial consulting firm. The job involved auditing corporate ledgers, assessing liability, and identifying the exact points where a business was bleeding capital. It was a brutal environment. The associates around me were graduates from elite universities with robust safety nets and custom-tailored suits. I wore clearance rack blazers and carried the constant, low-level panic of someone who had absolutely nothing to fall back on. To bridge the gap, I simply outworked them. I arrived at the office at 6 in the morning and rarely left before 8 at night. I scrutinized balance sheets until the numbers blurred into gray smudges, determined to prove that I belonged in that glass-walled building just as much as anyone else. My personal life was entirely stripped of luxury. I survived on a strict diet of heavily discounted frozen dinners, mostly Salisbury steak or rubbery macaroni and cheese, heated up in an ancient microwave that hummed ominously. I drove my same rusted sedan, praying every morning that the engine would turn over in the sub-zero temperatures. On weekends, I took on freelance bookkeeping gigs for local cafes. Every single extra penny I earned went toward paying down the small personal loans I had taken out to facilitate my move. I was building an unshakable fortress around myself, brick by boring brick, ensuring that no one would ever have the power to pull the rug out from under me again. Then, barely 11 months after I had left Belmere, my phone rang. Seeing Evelyn's name on the caller identification screen sent a shockwave of cold adrenaline straight to my fingertips. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but a lingering, pathetic thread of filial duty forced my thumb to answer. Her voice on the other end was stripped of its usual haughty theater. She sounded frail, breathless, and utterly exhausted. She told me Grant had fallen at the store. He had torn a rotator cuff in his shoulder and required surgery. But the real catastrophe was not medical, it was financial. Davis Hardware and Supply, the dusty, loyal cornerstone of our family for 3 decades, was drowning. Evelyn claimed they were swimming in supplier debt. Distributors were threatening to cut off their inventory completely. She said if they did not get an immediate injection of steady cash, the bank would foreclose on the property by the end of the quarter. I closed my eyes and leaned against the freezing window of my apartment. I did not care about Evelyn's tears, but the thought of the hardware store broke something open inside me. I remembered the smell of fresh-cut pine and machine oil. I remembered spending my Saturday mornings as a child sweeping the narrow aisles, sorting brass screws into tiny paper bags, and watching my dad quietly help local farmers fix their tractors. My dad was a silent, passive man, but the store was his entire life. I agreed to help. I committed to transferring $1,500 to their joint account on the first day of every single month. It was a massive, paralyzing chunk of my monthly take-home pay. It meant canceling the tiny heat upgrade for my apartment. It meant eating more frozen meals. But I justified it. I genuinely believed I was paying a ransom to save a piece of my own childhood from being erased. However, the strange, gnawing feeling in my gut started almost immediately. At North Glass, I made my living demanding receipts, verifying invoices, and tracking every single cent. Yet, when it came to my own family, I was flying completely blind. Whenever I asked Evelyn for a clear balance sheet or the current total of the supplier debt, the conversation would dramatically pivot. She would sigh and say the accountant had the files, or she would suddenly start crying about how much pain my dad was in that morning. There was never a hard number. There was never a forwarded invoice. There was only ever a new, vague crisis. A broken delivery truck, a sudden spike in property taxes, a delayed insurance payout, and a million reasons why a good daughter should not interrogate her grieving mother. 2 grueling years passed. I had clawed my way up to a mid-level analyst position. The monthly transfer of $1,500 was still draining my account, keeping me living far below my means. Then came the second phone call. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Evelyn called, her voice tight with a new, manufactured panic. She explained that the store needed to renew a commercial line of credit to secure an auxiliary warehouse for their spring inventory. The problem, she claimed, was that Grant's credit score had been decimated by the lingering medical bills from his shoulder surgery. The bank was refusing to renew the line under his name alone. She said they just needed a guarantor, a temporary cosigner. Just my name and my impeccable credit score on the application to make the debt-to-income ratio look acceptable to the underwriter. She swore up and down that it was a mere formality. The store would make all the payments. I would never have to lift a finger. Everything would be perfectly fine. I sat in my office cubicle, staring at the flashing cursor on my computer screen. Every single professional instinct I possessed screamed at me to hang up the phone. You do not guarantee commercial debt without seeing a profit and loss statement. You do not sign legally binding documents based on the tearful promises of a woman who chose a party over your graduation. But I hesitated. I pictured my dad again, older now, wincing in pain as he tried to lift boxes of heavy tools. I knew Evelyn was manipulative, but I still held on to the fragile, naive belief that my father would never allow her to intentionally destroy me. He might be weak, but he was not evil, I agreed. I received a digital document link later that evening. I clicked the authorization box and applied my electronic signature. Looking back, that click was the second most catastrophic miscalculation of my entire life, overshadowed only by the delusion that my college graduation was a day my family would respect. As I worked myself into the ground, earning my promotions through sheer, undeniable merit, the money in my savings account grew at an agonizingly slow pace. I was constantly stressed, constantly calculating grocery budgets down to the last cent, and then, during the rare 10-minute breaks I allowed myself, I would make the mistake of opening social media and looking at Mallory. The contrast was physically nauseating. While I was rationing a $4 frozen lasagna in my frigid studio, my sister was broadcasting a life of unbridled, aristocratic luxury. Her digital feed was an endless, curated scroll of towering champagne pyramids, imported floral backdrops that reached the ceiling, and custom-tailored silk dresses. She posted constant updates from Goldfinch gatherings, showcasing private galas and exclusive corporate retreats that easily cost tens of thousands of dollars to produce. Every photograph featured Mallory holding a crystal flute, flashing a brilliant smile, and writing lengthy captions about the grueling hustle of being a self-made female entrepreneur. The events were breathtakingly expensive, dripping with an excess that fundamentally defied logic. I would stare at my phone screen, my thumb hovering over the glossy images. My mother was calling me in tears, begging for money to keep the lights on at a failing hardware store. Yet my sister, the pride of the family, was currently operating a business that looked like it belonged to a millionaire, seemingly completely insulated from the financial apocalypse supposedly destroying our parents. A cold, heavy knot began to form in the very pit of my stomach. The math was not just wrong, it was impossible. The narrative of the drowning family was crashing violently into the visual reality of the golden child. I closed the app, the silence of my cheap apartment suddenly ringing in my ears. I was being bled dry, and I was finally starting to realize that the wound was not an accident. The ascent at North Glass Risk Advisory was not a matter of luck or corporate favoritism. It was the direct result of 1,000 late nights, skipped meals, and an absolute, uncompromising refusal to fail. I broke through the invisible ceiling to become a senior manager, earning a compensation package that finally allowed me to breathe without the constant, suffocating fear of an overdrawn bank account. For the first time in my life, I was not merely surviving the week, I was actively building a future. I set my sights on purchasing a high-end, heavily renovated industrial loft located deep in the Minneapolis Arts District. It featured soaring, exposed beam ceilings, original brick walls, and massive factory windows that flooded the expansive space with brilliant natural light. It was breathtakingly expensive, but it was going to be mine. It was a physical fortress that represented everything I had fought for: security, independence, and an identity completely detached from the dark, heavy gravity of my past. The mortgage pre-approval process should have been a seamless, utterly boring formality. I possessed an impeccable financial history, carefully curated over years of extreme frugality and obsessive tracking. My credit score hovered comfortably in the high 800s, but on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of a crucial quarterly review meeting, my loan officer called. His tone was tight, hesitant, and highly apologetic. A critical emergency flag had suddenly appeared on my comprehensive credit pull. A severe unresolved delinquency had just been reported to all 3 major bureaus, triggering a devastating, immediate drop in my score right at the most sensitive stage of the underwriting process. My stomach plummeted as I opened the encrypted PDF attachment he sent to my private email. There, glaring back at me in bold, unforgiving black font, was a formal notice of a severe late payment. It was over 90 days past due. It was directly tied to the commercial line of credit I had guaranteed for the family business 2 years prior. Panic, sharp and tasting like copper in the back of my throat, seized me. I immediately sent a text message to Evelyn, keeping my tone strictly factual but urgent. I asked why the account was in default and demanded immediate, documented proof that a payment had been dispatched to the lender. Her reply arrived 3 excruciating hours later. It was a masterclass in psychological deflection. She did not provide a confirmation number. She did not offer a single word of apology for jeopardizing my home purchase. Instead, she typed a lengthy, rambling paragraph, accusing me of becoming a cold, unfeeling city person who cared more about a banking algorithm than her own flesh and blood. She seamlessly pivoted the narrative, complaining bitterly about how much pressure my sister was under in the current fluctuating market, and detailing how the harsh winter cold was severely aggravating my father's aching joints. The actual critical issue of the late payment was completely buried beneath thick, suffocating layers of manufactured guilt. I tried to bypass her defensive wall and call my father directly. The phone rang out 5 times before Evelyn picked it up, claiming he was resting upstairs. The next day, she claimed he was at a physical therapy appointment. Whenever I did manage to receive a brief, stilted text message from his phone number, the syntax felt entirely wrong. The phrasing was too dramatic, too carefully punctuated to be his. It hit me then with a chilling, undeniable clarity. My mother was the absolute, unquestioned gatekeeper of that household. She aggressively controlled every single piece of information entering or leaving that house. My father was isolated, and I was being kept intentionally, systematically blind. To distract myself from the sinking feeling in my chest and the looming threat of losing the loft, I made the mistake of opening social media on my lunch break. My sister was broadcasting an entirely different, incredibly loud reality. Her latest post was a glossy professional carousel of images from a massive private event her company had just designed and executed. There were endless banquet tables draped in imported Belgian linen, towering, custom-built centerpieces of rare white orchids, and a massive, glowing champagne tower that easily cost thousands of dollars just to assemble. The caption bragged expansively about scaling the business and expanding her elite vendor network. The sheer, blinding opulence of her digital life stood in grotesque, sickening contrast to the narrative of a starving family business teetering on the very edge of bankruptcy. That evening, Owen Mercer was sitting at my small kitchen table, reviewing some commercial compliance briefs for his own firm. Owen and I had been dating quietly for the past 8 months. He worked deep within the regulatory compliance sector, He was grounded, intensely observant, and possessed the exact same cold, analytical mindset I did. I was pacing the worn floorboards of my apartment, furious and terrified about the mortgage falling through, when I finally handed him the printed credit report. I needed a completely objective, second pair of eyes to tell me I was not losing my mind. Owen took the paper, his eyes scanning the dense rows of financial data, his brow furrowed slightly. He tapped a specific line with the back of his silver pen. He looked up and asked me, very calmly, what the exact, legally registered name of my family's hardware store was. I told him it was Davis Hardware and Supply. Owen slid the paper across the wooden table toward me. He pointed directly to the legal entity listed as the primary account holder on the delinquent commercial loan. The name printed on the official credit bureau report did not say Davis Hardware and Supply. It listed a completely different, highly specific corporate limited liability company abbreviation. I stared at the letters, my vision instantly blurring at the edges. The oxygen in the room seemed to evaporate entirely. That tiny, seemingly insignificant alphabetical discrepancy acted like a razor blade, slicing completely and cleanly through the thick curtain of lies I had been forced to blindly accept for years. I was not a beloved, loyal daughter helping her tragic, struggling parents keep their heads above water. I was not protecting a cherished childhood legacy. I was a highly functional, easily manipulated financial instrument. I was a human shield, completely disposable, waiting to be dragged down the moment their hidden, reckless structures collapsed. The betrayal was so profound, so structurally complete, that it bypassed standard anger entirely and settled into a state of absolute, freezing, terrifying clarity. A normal person might have picked up the phone, called Belmere, and screamed into the receiver until their voice gave out. They might have demanded tearful answers or threatened legal action in a fit of uncontrollable rage. But I had spent my entire professional adult life auditing corporate disasters. I knew exactly how liars operated. I knew that confronting a manipulator without an airtight, impenetrable case only gave them the precious opportunity to destroy the remaining evidence, alert their accomplices, and entirely rewrite the narrative to make you look insane. I did not call Evelyn. I did not text my sister. I took a deep, shuddering breath, thanked Owen for his sharp eyes, poured myself a glass of ice water, and sat down at my desk. I opened my personal laptop. I created a new, secure, password-protected and encrypted folder on my hard drive. I opened a blank master spreadsheet. I went back to the very first month I had left home, 7 years prior. I logged every single bank transfer I had ever made to their joint checking accounts. I recorded the exact date, the precise amount down to the final cent, and the accompanying emotional excuse Evelyn had given me for needing the cash that specific month. I pulled every single email, downloaded every text message thread, and retrieved every signed digital PDF document I could extract from my cloud archives. I began to map out the timelines, ruthlessly cross-referencing my mother's tearful crisis narratives with my sister's extravagant, time-stamped social media uploads. I was no longer a confused daughter trying to navigate a complex family tragedy. I was a senior financial investigator, and I was finally opening a comprehensive, devastating fraud file on my own blood. Owen and I did not need to hire a private investigator. We did not need to break into any locked filing cabinets or wiretap a phone line. In the modern world of commerce, the most devastating secrets are rarely buried in a hidden safe. They are filed away in plain sight, entirely accessible to anyone patient enough to navigate a county clerk's poorly designed government website. We sat shoulder to shoulder at my kitchen island, bathed in the harsh, bluish glow of my monitor. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m. A pot of black coffee had gone cold hours ago. The silence in the loft was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my computer mouse as we pulled public business records, uniform commercial code filings, property transfer deeds, and active vendor licenses from the Belmere County Digital Archives. It took less than 45 minutes to uncover the first massive structural collapse of the narrative I had been fed. I pulled up the commercial property deed history for the exact address of the hardware store. The glowing screen displayed a formal transfer of ownership. The buyer was a regional auto parts chain. I dragged my finger across the monitor to check the date of the execution. The sale had been finalized, notarized, and legally recorded exactly 7 months before my mother had made that initial, panicked phone call. 7 months before she wept through the receiver about my father's torn shoulder and the aggressive suppliers threatening to padlock the doors. The crisis was a complete fabrication. The store was not drowning in debt when I began wiring $1,500 on the first of every single month. It did not even belong to my family anymore. The legacy I thought I was bleeding myself dry to protect had already been liquidated for cash. The air in my lungs turned to ice, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I closed that tab and opened the state registry for corporate entities. I typed in the limited liability company abbreviation we had found on my ruined credit report. The page loaded instantly. The second blow landed directly on my chest. The registered legal name of the entity holding the delinquent commercial line of credit was Goldfinch Gatherings. I stared at the bold letters until they burned into my retinas. It was my sister's business, the exact same luxury event planning studio whose lavish, champagne-soaked grand opening had taken absolute priority over my college graduation. My mother had not tricked me into guaranteeing a survival loan for a dusty, struggling hardware store. She had weaponized my pristine credit history to bankroll my sister's extravagant corporate vanity project. The sheer, poetic cruelty of it was physically nauseating. The very entity that had robbed me of my parents on the most important day of my academic life was now surviving by parasitically feeding off my financial identity. I was unknowingly funding the grand, glittering illusion of the sister who had always overshadowed me. But the third discovery was what shifted the situation from a severe moral betrayal into the territory of a major federal felony. Owen, leaning closer to the screen, pointed to the digital signature log attached to the most recent loan renewal application. We pulled the metadata. It showed an electronic signature authorization, stamped with my exact legal name, executed on a Tuesday afternoon exactly 8 months prior. It included an Internet Protocol address and a digital confirmation receipt that had supposedly been sent to an old email account I had not used since high school. I opened my digital work calendar and navigated back to that specific week. My chest tightened into a hard, unforgiving knot. On that exact Tuesday, I was 2 states away. I was sitting in a windowless conference room at a secure corporate retreat, participating in a mandatory, closed-door compliance training seminar for Northglass Risk Advisory. We had surrendered our personal devices at the door. I had hotel receipts, airline boarding passes, signed attendance sheets, and keycard swipe logs, proving definitively that I was entirely offline and hundreds of miles away from a computer. I had never seen that renewal document. I had never clicked that authorization box. Someone in that house had flawlessly forged my digital signature to keep the fraudulent credit line alive. I leaned back in my chair, the cold wood pressing against my spine. I was not just a naive daughter who had been manipulated into handing over cash. My name, my hard-earned credit reputation, and my legal identity had been hijacked and dragged deep into a volatile, high-risk financial structure without my knowledge, let alone my consent. I was sitting on a bomb I did not build, and the timer was already ticking down to 0. Owen finally broke the heavy silence. His voice was low, laced with the sharp, clinical urgency of a man who dealt with corporate fraud for a living. He told me I needed to lock down my entire credit profile immediately. He instructed me to draft a sworn affidavit, hire a defense attorney by 9 in the morning, and file a formal police report for identity theft and wire fraud. He warned me that if Goldfinch Gatherings collapsed entirely, the creditors would come directly after my assets, including the down payment for my new home. I looked at him, the glow of the screen reflecting in his worried eyes. Every logical, self-preserving instinct agreed with him, but I shook my head. I refused to act immediately. I refused to send a panicked email or fire off an angry legal threat. Owen looked genuinely confused, but I knew my mother's playbook better than anyone on earth. Evelyn was a master of the narrative pivot. If I tipped my hand now, if I gave her even a 24-hour warning, she would immediately shift into the role of the overwhelmed, confused victim. She would claim it was a terrible clerical error made by a careless bank employee. She would destroy the old computer, delete the email accounts, and rally the entire town of Belmere to her defense, painting me as a paranoid, ungrateful daughter trying to destroy her own family over a simple paperwork mistake. She would slip right through the net. I could not just wound the beast, I had to completely trap it. I needed to gather every single piece of undeniable physical evidence. I needed the trap to be so structurally sound, so legally terrifying, that when I finally snapped it shut, there would be absolutely zero room for her to spin a new story. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, plunging the kitchen island into darkness. The quiet realization washed over me, cold and absolute. This was no longer a sad, Midwestern family tragedy about favoritism or neglect. It was a highly coordinated, systemic fraud operation. It was a parasite that had been feeding on my isolation and my desperate, pathetic desire for their approval for years. The beast had survived on my default acceptance and my unbroken silence, but the silence was over. The investigation was closed. Now, I was going to build the stage for the final act, and I was going to make absolutely sure they all showed up for the performance. To truly dismantle a lie of this magnitude, I needed the anatomy of the deception. I needed to see the skeleton beneath the skin. I could not rely on assumptions or angry accusations. I needed an unimpeachable paper trail, and for that, I had to make my first strategic phone call. I reached out to my cousin, Tessa Dane. Tessa worked as a senior clerk in the Belmere County Records Archive. We were never particularly close, but we shared a mutual, unspoken understanding of my mother's theatrical nature. I called her during my lunch hour, pacing the empty concrete corridor outside my office. I did not ask her to break any municipal protocols or steal confidential files. I simply asked her where I should look. Tessa, ever the cautious bureaucrat, spoke in careful, measured hypotheticals. She told me that if someone wanted to trace the exact flow of liquidated commercial assets in our county, they should definitely not ignore the public commercial lease addendums and the vendor deposit receipts filed during the same fiscal quarter. She gave me the exact alphanumeric codes for the request forms. I submitted the public records requests online. When the digital copies finally hit my secure inbox 2 days later, the fog of confusion I had been living in instantly solidified into a massive, impenetrable wall of concrete. The documents outlined the exact terms of the hardware store's liquidation. It had been sold for over $350,000. But the subsequent banking trails, legally attached to the Public Business Registry, showed the brutal truth of where that cash had actually gone. Not a single cent had been routed to a hospital billing department. None of it had gone to a physical therapist for my father's shoulder. Instead, the money had been systematically funneled into the foundational infrastructure of Goldfinch gatherings. I sat staring at the itemized vendor receipts. My father's lifetime of quiet labor had paid for a 10-year commercial lease on the most expensive corner of downtown Belmere. The money I thought was saving my family from ruin had actually purchased imported, hand-stitched velvet lounge chairs. It had funded the construction of a custom mahogany tasting bar. It had paid a boutique contractor to install a sprawling, permanent wall of white silk roses for bridal photo shoots. Evelyn had ruthlessly butchered my father's legacy and my own financial stability just to build Mallory a glittering, unearned throne. The physical sensation of the betrayal was suffocating, but I needed to know exactly how far the rot had spread. I needed to know how Evelyn had managed to hide this from our extended family, who lived just a few streets over. I picked up my phone and called my father's older brother, Uncle Russell Davis. I tried to keep my voice light, pretending I was just calling to casually check in on the family. The phone rang 6 long times. When Russell finally answered, the hostility in his voice was thick and immediate. He let out a sharp, cynical laugh and said it was a miracle I had finally remembered I had blood relatives. I kept my tone perfectly even and asked him how my father was handling the loss of the store. Russell scoffed loudly into the receiver. He then proceeded to recount, with aggressive self-righteousness, the narrative my mother had been feeding the entire town for years. According to Evelyn, I had moved to the sprawling city, become completely obsessed with corporate ladders, and fundamentally changed into a cold, arrogant stranger. She had stood in the church foyer, weeping into a tissue, telling aunts, uncles, and neighbors that I had explicitly refused to send even $10 to help my struggling parents. She claimed I ignored their calls and abandoned them in their darkest hour. The town of Belmere already held a fully formed, horribly distorted version of who I was. I was the villain of their tragic Midwestern story. I was the ungrateful daughter who ran away. Meanwhile, in reality, I had been bleeding my own checking account dry, transferring $1,500 every single month, essentially paying a heavy, devastating tax to subsidize my own character assassination. I thanked Russell tightly for his time and ended the call. I was pouring myself a glass of water when my phone buzzed with a text message from Tessa. She was following up on our earlier conversation, adding a casual, seemingly innocent warning. She typed that I should not be too hard on Mallory, because Mallory actually thought she was protecting me. I froze. I immediately dialed Tessa's number. I demanded to know exactly what she meant. Tessa sounded hesitant, realizing she had stepped onto a landmine. She explained that during a family barbecue a year ago, Mallory had cornered her after a few glasses of wine. Mallory had bragged, in absolute, strict confidence, that her little sister was actually her primary silent angel investor. According to Mallory, I was voluntarily funneling my lucrative corporate salary into goldfinch gatherings because I believed in her vision. The only reason it was kept a secret, Evelyn had told Mallory, was because I desperately wanted to avoid extended relatives asking me for financial handouts, and I did not want to look like I was playing favorites. I dropped my phone onto the sofa. The sheer, magnificent architecture of the lie left me momentarily breathless. It was a masterpiece of emotional compartmentalization. In that house, Evelyn had acted as a master director, handing out a completely different script to every single person, ensuring no two actors ever compared their lines. I was handed the desperate, tragic script of saving a dying father and a bankrupt family business. Mallory was handed the empowering, flattering script that her wealthy sister was quietly backing her business. The extended relatives in the town were handed the dramatic script of the cruel, abandoning daughter, and Grant, my father. Grant was the cowardly stagehand who knew the truth behind the curtains, but chose absolute, paralyzing silence, vastly preferring the quiet comfort of a lie over the explosive fallout of a confrontation. I was the only one paying the admission ticket for a show I was not even allowed to watch. The next morning, I made my final, most important phone call. I contacted the commercial fraud division of the banking institution holding the forged line of credit. I bypassed the standard customer service representatives and reached a senior investigator. Her tone was clinical and entirely devoid of emotion. I explained the discrepancy with the digital signature. I told her I was in a different state on the day the document was supposedly authorized. The investigator's response was swift and absolute. She informed me that if I submitted a formal, notarized affidavit legally swearing I did not authorize the signature, the bank would immediately freeze the entire credit account. They would legally mandate a comprehensive federal fraud investigation. My personal financial liability would be entirely severed, and the devastating burden of proof, along with the immediate demand for full repayment, would fall squarely onto the shoulders of Goldfinch Gatherings. She emailed me the blank affidavit form while we were still on the line. I printed it out on my heavy office stationery. During my lunch break, I walked 3 blocks in the freezing wind to a local shipping center and paid a notary public $5 to witness my signature and stamp the document with his official seal. I slid the crisp, heavy paper into a brown manila envelope. I wrote the bank's fraud department address perfectly in the center, but I did not seal the envelope. I did not drop it into the blue postal box on the corner. If I mailed that document now, from the safety of Minneapolis, it would be too clean. Evelyn would receive a certified notification from the bank within 48 to 72 hours. she would have the luxury of time. Time to scramble, time to cry, time to invent a brand new, elaborate story about how she was just an overwhelmed mother trying to keep her family afloat and made a desperate, innocent paperwork mistake. She would easily convince Mallory and my father that I was launching an unprovoked, malicious attack. I could not simply cut the financial cord from a safe distance. I had to ensure the entire structure collapsed inward. I decided, standing right there on the frozen sidewalk, that I was going back to Belmere. I was not returning to cry on their sofa, and I was certainly not returning to ask for an explanation. I was going back to lock every single person who was comfortably living inside their own custom-built version of the truth into one single room. I was going to force them all to sit down, and I was going to make them listen to the one and only script that actually mattered. It happened on a surprisingly quiet Sunday afternoon. The harsh winter light was spilling perfectly across the wide, distressed oak floorboards of my new living room. I had finally finished unpacking the last few heavy cardboard boxes. The space was completely mine, bought and secured entirely through my own relentless, bone-deep grinding. I took my phone out of my back pocket and snapped a single photograph of the expansive, sunlit room, capturing the soaring ceiling and the massive industrial windows that overlooked the city skyline. I did not include my face in the frame. I did not tag the prestigious arts district or mention the astronomical purchase price. I simply typed a single 4-letter word as the caption, home. I pressed post, locked the screen, and tossed the device onto the granite kitchen counter to go make a cup of black coffee. I did not even make it to the espresso machine before the notifications started. At first, it was just a few generic likes, but within 2 hours, my device was vibrating violently against the stone countertop. It was as if that single image of a beautiful, expensive architectural space had acted as a high-frequency dog whistle for a bloodline that had otherwise completely forgotten my existence. Suddenly, my older sister was commenting with heart emojis, exclaiming how proud she was of her little sibling. 2 of my aunts, women who had explicitly ignored my existence at the local grocery store during my last visit to Missouri, were sending me private messages asking when they could come up to the city for a grand tour. The sudden warmth pouring out of the screen was suffocating, entirely artificial, and deeply transactional. They did not see a home. They saw an asset. They saw a safety net. Then came the private text message from Evelyn. It popped onto my screen right at 5 o'clock in the evening. "Darling," she wrote, using an affectionate pet name she had not directed at me since I was 7 years old. "We miss you so terribly. Please come home this weekend. The whole family wants to make a beautiful dinner just for you. We need to catch up properly." I stared at the glowing text. I did not feel a sudden rush of familial warmth or a desperate yearning for my mother's embrace. I felt the cold, sharp prick of a steel snare snapping shut in the tall grass. It was never just a dinner. Evelyn did not bake casseroles out of unconditional love. She baked them as stage props. I could literally smell the heavy, suffocating scent of her theatrical direction radiating from the digital screen before a single chair was even pulled out from the dining table. She needed something massive, and the photograph of the luxury loft had just firmly convinced her that I had deep enough pockets to provide it. I did not reply immediately. Instead, I opened my secure banking application. I navigated directly to the Recurring Payments tab. There, sitting quietly in the ledger, was the automatic monthly transfer of $1,500 that I had faithfully sent to my parents' checking account for years. With 2 simple taps on the glass screen, I canceled it. I completely shut off the flow, like turning a valve until nothing more could pass through. I watched the confirmation banner slide down, feeling a strange, hollow sense of absolute finality. Next, I walked over to my home office desk. I pulled out a thick, heavy-duty black binder. This upcoming weekend was not going to be a messy, emotional shouting match in a crowded living room. This was going to be a highly structured, clinical demolition. I began loading the binder with physical ammunition. Behind the first plastic divider went the meticulously compiled chronological timeline of every single dollar I had ever sent them, perfectly cross-referenced with my mother's fabricated crisis texts. Behind the second divider went the official county property deed, proving the hardware store had been sold off for cash months before the supposed financial emergency. Behind the third went the state business registry, clearly linking my sister's luxury event company to the fraudulent line of credit. Behind the fourth went the digital log of the forged electronic signature, completely exposing the federal wire fraud. And finally, tucked securely into the very back pocket, was the crisp, notarized affidavit from the bank's fraud department, still unsealed, still unmailed, acting as the absolute final nail in the coffin. Owen stood leaning against the doorframe of my office, quietly watching me methodically snap the heavy metal rings of the binder shut. He had agreed to make the 3-hour drive down to Missouri with me, but we had established incredibly strict ground rules for the evening. I made him promise, absolutely swear to me, that he would not step in to save me with his words. I did not need a white knight to yell at my parents on my behalf. If the room inevitably devolved into a hysterical, weeping emotional court, I needed a grounded anchor. I needed an objective, professional witness sitting completely still, refusing to be pulled into Evelyn's chaotic, spinning orbit. Owen's presence alone, a corporate compliance officer sitting silently in their dining room, would be enough to disrupt the psychological control my mother heavily relied on to manipulate her audiences. He nodded slowly, understanding the assignment perfectly. We left Minneapolis early Saturday afternoon. The drive south was long and heavy with unspoken tension. Owen handled the steering wheel while I sat rigidly in the passenger seat, the black binder resting securely on my lap like a loaded weapon. As we crossed the state line and began passing the familiar rusted billboards and sprawling agricultural fields of my youth, I waited for the usual wave of melancholy to hit me. For years, returning to Belmere always felt like walking into a heavy, suffocating fog of guilt and inadequacy, but this time, staring out the window at the passing landscape at 70 miles per hour, I felt absolutely nothing. The nostalgia had been entirely burned away by the acid of their betrayal. Every familiar landmark, the old high school football stadium, the dusty intersection where I used to buy cheap coffee before my graveyard shifts, the faded brick sign of the county archive building, no longer felt like pieces of a sad childhood. They felt like silent, patient witnesses, finally lining up behind me, waiting to be called to the stand. The sun was just beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement as Owen finally turned the car onto my parents' street. I instructed him to slow down to 10 miles per hour as we approached the property. My grip on the black binder tightened until my knuckles turned stark white. Evelyn had explicitly promised a small, intimate family dinner. "Just us," she had typed, but as we rolled past the neighboring houses, the reality of the situation came into sharp, undeniable focus. The curbsides were completely jammed with vehicles. I recognized my uncle's heavy-duty pickup truck, my aunt's silver minivan, and my sister's immaculate luxury sport utility vehicle. But there were others, too. Cars belonging to local church members, prominent town gossips, and a local business owner my father used to play cards with. Owen let out a low, quiet whistle from the driver's seat. He shifted the car into park at the very end of the long line of vehicles, easily a block away from the front door. I looked at the house through the windshield. The front porch lights were blazing aggressively. The living room curtains were pulled wide open, revealing a house packed shoulder to shoulder with people holding wine glasses and talking loudly. It was not a dinner. It was a fully populated amphitheater. Evelyn had assembled her entire cast and her loyal audience, ensuring that whatever trap she was about to spring on me would be witnessed by the whole town. She was banking heavily on the fact that social pressure, polite etiquette, and public embarrassment would force me to smile, nod, and agree to whatever massive financial sacrifice she was about to demand. She had set the stage perfectly, but as I opened the car door and stepped out onto the cold concrete, clutching the heavy binder to my chest, I knew something she did not. She had absolutely no idea that I was the one who had actually written the script for tonight's final act. The heavy oak front door swung open before I even reached the top step of the porch. A blast of overly heated air, smelling sharply of roasted garlic, cheap wine, and heavy floral perfume hit my face. I stepped over the threshold, Owen trailing a polite half-step behind me, and walked straight into a suffocating wall of forced Midwestern hospitality. The living room was packed shoulder to shoulder. There were at least 24 people crammed into a space designed for 10. I recognized the familiar, judgmental faces of my extended family, but my eyes immediately snagged on the outsiders. Pastor Miller stood by the fireplace, nursing a glass of iced tea. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the largest commercial lumber yard in Belmere, was chatting loudly near the bookshelf. This was not a casual barbecue to welcome a prodigal daughter. This was a carefully curated jury. Before I could even take off my wool coat, Evelyn materialized from the hallway. She wore a pristine cream-colored silk blouse and a smile so wide and brightly manufactured it looked painful. She threw her arms around me, engulfing me in a crushing, dramatic hug. She pulled back just far enough to ensure everyone in the room could hear her projecting voice. "Look who finally made it home," she announced, her tone dripping with a honeyed sweetness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The absolute pride of our family. I allowed my face to remain perfectly blank. I did not flinch, and I did not return the embrace. I simply observed her. It was fascinating, in a deeply grotesque way, to watch a predator change its camouflage in real time. For years, I was the ungrateful burden, the cold city dweller who abandoned her roots. Tonight, because she needed something massive from me, I had been miraculously resurrected as the beloved, triumphant hero. She had not changed her fundamental nature. She had merely swapped out her costume for the evening. I glanced past her perfectly coiffed hair and spotted my father. Grant was standing near the edge of the kitchen island, a sweating bottle of light beer clutched in his right hand. He did not step forward to greet me. He did not meet my eyes. He kept his gaze locked firmly on the speckled granite countertop. His shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible, crushing pressure. He looked exactly like a man who fully realized his house was slowly sinking into a toxic swamp, but who had lived in the damp rot for so many years that he completely forgot how to walk on solid ground. He knew exactly what this night was designed to do, and true to his nature, he was choosing absolute, cowardly paralysis over intervention. I moved further into the house, Owen acting as a silent, immovable shadow at my side. At the far end of the sprawling dining table sat Mallory. My sister looked like a magazine editorial cut out and pasted into a suburban dining room. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled in effortless, expensive waves. But the illusion fractured the moment I looked at her hands. Her knuckles were stark white as she aggressively shredded a paper napkin under the table. Her eyes darted toward me, wide and tight with poorly concealed panic. She genuinely believed that I was there to write a massive check. She thought I was the silent angel investor arriving to save her sinking ship. She had absolutely no idea how deep our mother's staging actually went, or that the ship had already been burned to ash. Evelyn ushered everyone toward the dining area, orchestrating the seating arrangements with the aggressive precision of a military general. She placed me near the head of the table, flanked by Pastor Miller and Aunt Martha, creating a physical barricade of moral authority. The dinner itself was a masterclass in psychological tension. For 45 agonizing minutes, we passed heavy porcelain bowls of mashed potatoes and sliced roast beef. The conversation was a shallow, suffocating stream of polite interrogations. They asked about the weather in Minneapolis. They asked about my corporate job, nodding with feigned interest while completely ignoring the actual answers. I ate nothing. I drank only ice water. I could feel the oxygen in the room slowly thinning, replaced by a thick, heavy anticipation. Every scrape of a fork against a ceramic plate sounded like a gunshot. The pleasantries were just the opening act, the necessary social lubrication before the real performance began. Right as the plates were being cleared for dessert, the moment arrived. Evelyn stood up from her chair at the head of the table. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against the rim of her crystal wine glass. The bright, ringing sound cut through the low hum of chatter, demanding absolute silence. The room quieted instantly, Every single face turned toward my mother. Evelyn offered a soft, trembling smile to the audience, placing a hand delicately over her heart. "We are so incredibly blessed tonight," she began, her voice perfectly modulated to project a humble maternal grace. "As many of you know, the market has been exceptionally brutal lately. Running a local business takes a toll, and Goldfinch Gatherings has been facing some very heavy, unexpected headwinds." She paused, letting the solemnity of her words settle over the guests. Then, she turned her bright, theatrical gaze directly onto me. "But our family has always found a way to survive. And that is because we take care of our own. I am so overwhelmed with gratitude to announce that my brilliant, successful daughter has agreed to step in. She has graciously offered to help us restructure the current debt and provide the necessary financial backing to save a dozen major event contracts from going under this spring." The trap snapped shut with a deafening, sickening precision. Before I could even part my lips to speak, Evelyn raised her glass high in the air. "To family," she declared loudly. The entire room erupted into enthusiastic applause. Pastor Miller patted me heavily on the shoulder. Aunt Martha beamed at me from across the table. "Mr." Henderson raised his beer bottle in a gesture of deep, communal respect. It was a flawless, terrifying social execution. By announcing my supposed generosity as an established, undisputed fact in front of the entire community, Evelyn had effectively backed me into a corner entirely devoid of light. If I refused now, if I corrected her in front of the pastor and the neighbors, I would instantly become the villain. I would be the cold, heartless corporate monster, humiliating her weeping, desperate mother and letting her sister's business die a public death. I would look incredibly selfish. As the clapping slowly died down, Mallory stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. She picked up the baton right on cue. Her eyes were shining with unshed, genuine tears. "I just want to say thank you," Mallory said, her voice catching perfectly in her throat. "You have absolutely no idea the kind of pressure I have been under. I have 5 full-time employees who rely on me to feed their families. I have vendors who trust my reputation. I have not slept a full 8 hours in 6 months trying to keep this dream alive. Knowing that you are standing behind me, knowing that my little sister believes in my vision enough to throw a lifeline when we are drowning, it means the absolute world to me. We just need to finalize the paperwork tonight, and we can finally breathe again." She reached across the table, offering her hand to me, her face a portrait of desperate, profound relief. She was waiting for me to take it. The entire room was waiting for me to take it. They were waiting for me to pick up my glass, nod graciously, and accept my role as the silent, bleeding martyr. The silence in the dining room stretched out, tight and humming like a high-voltage wire. I did not reach out to take my sister's trembling hand. I did not pick up my crystal water glass to return the toast. I did not look at the pastor, or the neighbors, or my cowardly father staring at the floor. I reached down into the canvas tote bag resting at my feet. I pulled out the heavy, thick black binder. The metal rings inside clacked ominously in the quiet room. I placed it squarely in the dead center of the dining table, right next to the floral centerpiece. I flattened my hands on the cool leather cover. I looked directly into Evelyn's eyes, watching the triumphant, manufactured warmth in her expression flicker and violently die. The polite, suffocating facade of the dinner party instantly fractured. The room did not know exactly what was happening yet, but every single person at that table suddenly felt the terrifying, undeniable shift in the atmospheric pressure. The script had just caught fire, and I was holding the matches. The silence in the dining room was absolute, a suffocating vacuum that swallowed every breath. I kept my hands resting flat and steady on the cool leather cover of the binder. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice to match the theatrical pitch my mother had just established. Anger is a messy, unpredictable element, easily dismissed as a childish tantrum, but cold, documented truth, presented with surgical precision, is a terrifying force. I spoke, my tone entirely flat and conversational, offering zero emotional traction for anyone to grab onto. I never promised to save my sister's business, I said clearly, letting the words bounce off the silent walls. And before anyone in this room raises another glass to the sacred concept of family, I would like everyone to look at a few simple, public pieces of paper. I flipped open the heavy black cover. The snap of the metal rings echoed like a rifle bolt in the quiet room. I pulled the first document from its clear plastic sleeve and laid it flat on the polished wood, pushing it toward the center of the table where the floral centerpiece sat. "This is the finalized commercial bill of sale for the family hardware store," I stated, keeping my eyes locked on Evelyn. Notice the execution date highlighted in yellow. The property was legally transferred, and the transaction was fully closed exactly 7 months before I received the first phone call begging for an emergency cash injection to stop a supplier foreclosure. A collective, confused murmur rippled through the guests. Aunt Martha leaned forward, squinting at the crisp legal document. Evelyn's flawless, manufactured smile froze, the corners of her mouth twitching as her brain violently scrambled to find a narrative exit. Before she could speak, I turned the page and pulled out the second piece of evidence. It was a dense, multi-page spreadsheet printed on heavy stock paper. I placed it directly on top of the deed. "This is a comprehensive chronological ledger," I continued, my voice relentless and steady. "It details every single transfer of $1,500 I made into my parents' joint checking account over the past several years." I did not add a single word of personal commentary. The columns show only the exact date, the precise amount of cash transferred, and the specific text message or voicemails explaining which fictional medical bill or imaginary warehouse debt urgently required my corporate salary to fix. The air in the room grew incredibly dense. The pastor looked down at his plate, entirely out of his depth, but I was not finished. The foundation of the table was cracking, and I was about to completely shatter the floorboards. I reached into the back pocket of the binder and pulled out the thick stack of commercial credit reports and banking agreements. I slid them across the table. They stopped right in front of my sister's pristine, untouched dinner plate. "This is the master file for a commercial line of credit," I said, allowing a fraction of the legal weight to drop into my voice. "It does not belong to the hardware store. It is registered directly to the Luxury Event Planning Limited Liability Company. More importantly, it features my legal name as the primary financial guarantor on several recent liability amendments that I absolutely never authorized." The shock that paralyzed the dining room had nothing to do with standard family drama. It was the sudden, freezing realization of severe legal jeopardy. Everyone sitting at that table, from the gossiping aunts to the church members, understood that forging a signature on a corporate bank loan was not a harsh parenting mistake. It was a major federal crime. Evelyn slammed her hands flat against the table, the silverware rattling violently against the porcelain plates. "It is a paperwork mix-up," she shrieked, her voice cracking, entirely losing the elegant maternal cadence she had spent decades perfecting. "It is just a terrible, stupid misunderstanding within the house. You are confusing the business accounts. We would never do something like that." I did not argue with her frantic, flailing emotions. I simply reached back into the binder and pulled out the final layer of proof. I dropped a corporate travel manifest and a hotel receipt onto the table. "I am not confused," I replied, my voice slicing through her panic like a scalpel. On the exact Tuesday afternoon that these digital signatures were executed from an internet protocol address located inside this very house, I was attending a mandatory, secure compliance training seminar 2 states away. I have the airline boarding passes, the hotel keycard swipe logs, and the sworn attendance sheets proving I was hundreds of miles away from a computer. I did not sign those papers, Mr. Henderson, the owner of the local lumber yard, who sat on the advisory board of the regional credit union, slowly reached out and pulled the bank documents closer to his chest. He scanned the header, his eyes widening as he recognized the institutional logo and the severity of the forged guarantee, all the color completely drained from his weathered face. He looked at Evelyn with absolute, undeniable horror. He understood exactly what he was looking at. Evelyn saw his expression, and for the very first time in her life, She realized that the grand stage she had meticulously built was sliding completely out of her control. There was no emotional spin she could put on a time-stamped federal fraud document. The agonizing silence that followed was violently broken by a voice from the kitchen. The store was sold. Every head snapped toward my father. Grant was gripping the edge of the granite kitchen island so hard his knuckles were stark white. He did not look up. He stared directly at the floorboards, his voice hollow and completely defeated. "It was sold a long time ago," he muttered, the words barely carrying across the room. She was never told the truth. It was a pathetic, microscopic admission. It offered no salvation, no protection, and no real apology. But hearing the patriarchal figure of the family confirm the absolute worst of the accusations tore away the final, clinging layer of the illusion. The lie was dead, and its corpse was lying right in the middle of the dining table. I looked down the length of the table at my older sister. Mallory was completely paralyzed. The heavy linen napkin she had been shredding slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. The flawless, confident facade of the successful, self-made entrepreneur dissolved entirely. She stared at the bank files, then at our mother, then down at her own expensive silk dress. The devastating reality finally crashed over her. The luxurious business she had endlessly paraded across social media, the enterprise our mother had proudly described as a beautiful family dream, was entirely built on stolen blood. It had actively cannibalized her younger sister's income, hijacked a pristine credit score, and mortgaged a financial future she had no right to touch. The lavish reunion dinner had entirely ceased to be a stage designed to force my compliance. It had transformed into a brutal, inescapable autopsy of a completely corrupt family system. No one clapped, no one raised a glass. They simply sat in the wreckage, staring at the architect of their destruction, waiting for the ceiling to finally cave in. The dining room felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked through the heavy oak floorboards. Evelyn stood completely frozen at the head of the long table. Her eyes darted frantically across the faces of the assembled guests, desperately searching for a single sympathetic gaze or a sliver of understanding. Finding absolutely nothing but cold, undeniable horror reflecting back at her from the pastor and the neighbors, she instantly deployed her secondary defense mechanism. When the proud matriarch routine completely failed, she seamlessly became the helpless, overwhelmed martyr. She slapped her palms against her expensive silk skirt and began to pace the narrow stretch of floor behind her chair. She did not offer a single word of apology. Instead, she pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my father. She shrieked that Grant had been far too weak and passive to manage the shifting retail market, claiming that his utter incompetence and laziness had driven their household to the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. Then, she pivoted sharply toward my sister. She wailed loudly about Mallory's crippling naivete, insisting that the luxury event business would have completely drowned in its first 6 months if a desperate mother had not made agonizing, legally questionable sacrifices to keep the doors open. Finally, she blamed the town of Belmere itself, sobbing hysterically about the immense, crushing social pressure to maintain a respectable, affluent image in a community that thrived on gossip. She attempted to paint her highly calculated, multi-year financial fraud as the tragic, unavoidable reflex of a terrified woman who had been backed into a dark corner by everyone else's catastrophic failures. She was trying to bury the severe federal forgery under a massive avalanche of emotional noise. But before her manufactured tears could successfully manipulate the stunned audience, a sharp voice cut completely through the heavy, suffocating air from the back of the living room. It was my cousin, Tessa. She stepped out from the deep shadows near the hallway archway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Tessa looked directly at Evelyn and delivered the most devastating, precise blow of the entire evening. Tessa revealed to the silent room that during her routine, quiet review of the county commercial archives earlier that week, she had recognized the exact digital signature file attached to the fraudulent loan amendments. It was not a generic electronic stamp. It was an exact, high-resolution scanned duplicate of my physical handwriting. Tessa explained, her voice remarkably steady and loud enough for the neighbors to hear. That the signature had been meticulously extracted from a physical set of college apartment rental applications I had mailed home for safekeeping nearly 4 years prior. A collective, sickening gasp rippled through the dining room. This specific detail fundamentally altered the entire nature of the crime. Evelyn had not simply panicked and forged a document in the heat of a single, stressful afternoon. She had deliberately archived my personal identification documents and my signature as a hidden, strategic toolkit. She had kept my legal identity securely locked away in a drawer, patiently waiting for the exact moment she needed to cannibalize my credit history to authorize a fraudulent corporate transaction I knew absolutely nothing about. It was premeditated, cold-blooded financial theft. At that exact moment, Owen finally broke the strict vow of silence we had agreed upon during the long car ride. He did not yell. He did not stand up or wave his arms in anger. He simply leaned forward, resting his forearms squarely on the polished dining table, and spoke with the cold, undeniable authority of a senior corporate compliance executive. He looked directly at Mr. Henderson, the regional credit union board member who was currently gripping the edge of his chair, and then at Evelyn. Owen stated, clearly and calmly, that the banking institution's federal fraud division already had a dedicated investigation line entirely open and waiting for evidence. He explained to the breathless room that if I simply confirmed the signature was a malicious forgery, the entire commercial file would officially change status at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. He methodically outlined the immediate, unavoidable consequences, listing severe federal wire fraud charges, the immediate freezing of all business assets, and impending criminal prosecution. His calm, clinical tone completely stripped away the final remnants of the messy family drama, replacing it with the terrifying, sterile, and unforgiving reality of the American legal system. That was the exact moment Mallory completely exploded. My sister stood up so violently that her heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the floorboards. She stared at our mother, her flawless, expensive makeup now ruined and streaked with angry, hot tears. Mallory screamed that Evelyn had explicitly told her I was acting as a willing, highly supportive silent angel investor. Mallory revealed to the entire horrified room that she had been fed a completely different, intensely flattering lie. She had been told by our mother that I was voluntarily funneling my lucrative corporate salary into the event business to gain strategic tax benefits and to strictly avoid other extended relatives begging me for financial handouts. Mallory clutched the edge of the dining table, her voice breaking into a guttural sob as she realized the horrifying depth of the psychological manipulation. She screamed that she had spent years quietly praising my supposed generosity, genuinely believing she was building a beautiful family empire, only to discover she was the oblivious parasite completely draining her own younger sister's future. The entire narrative she had built her adult identity and her entrepreneurial pride around was completely vaporized in an instant. She was not a self-made success. She was the beneficiary of a stolen identity. Before Evelyn could even attempt to construct a new lie to pacify Mallory, Uncle Russell stepped forward from the kitchen. His face was flushed dark red with absolute fury. Russell delivered a brutal, crushing blow to the one thing Evelyn valued above absolutely everything else, her flawless public reputation. Russell pointed directly at Evelyn and loudly confessed to the entire crowd that she had ruthlessly exploited the image of the abandoned, weeping mother for years. He detailed how she had weaponized the fake story of my cruel estrangement to systematically extract deep sympathy, borrow thousands of dollars in emergency cash from the extended family under false pretenses, and secure countless favors from the church congregation and local neighbors. She had aggressively farmed the town's pity, using my manufactured villainy as a highly profitable social currency. The neighbors and church members standing in the room exchanged horrified, deeply disgusted glances, realizing they had been used as foolish pawns in a sick, theatrical production designed to fund a luxury party planning business. The room was practically vibrating with raw anger and betrayal. Then, my father finally spoke again. Grant stepped away from the kitchen counter, leaving his untouched bottle of beer behind. He looked at me, his eyes hollow and filled with a pathetic, deeply useless sorrow. He confessed, his voice trembling violently in the quiet room, that he had known about the redirected funds for at least the first 12 months. He admitted that he had watched Evelyn take the $1,500 I sent every single month to supposedly save his hardware store, and he watched her immediately divert it to pay Mallory's expensive floral vendors and imported furniture suppliers. He tried to justify his cowardice to the crowd, claiming he had remained entirely silent because he truly believed that keeping the fragile peace in the house was far better than triggering an explosive, catastrophic confrontation with his wife. His confession did not soften my posture. It did not invite a sudden wave of familial forgiveness or understanding. Instead, it solidified the absolute disgust churning in my stomach. Hearing him admit that he actively chose his own quiet comfort over my financial and emotional survival demonstrated to the entire room that cowardice always carries a massive, devastating price. His silence was the exact fertile soil that allowed Evelyn's rot to flourish and destroy everything it touched. The atmosphere in the house shifted violently. The grand orchestrated reunion dinner had entirely collapsed into a scene of complete devastation. The facade of the wealthy, successful, deeply connected family was completely stripped down to the bare, rotting studs. Evelyn and Grant realized simultaneously that they had absolutely no leverage left. They were surrounded by angry witnesses who now knew every single dark detail of their systemic deception. The proud, authoritative tone they had used to greet me an hour earlier completely evaporated into the stale air. For the very first time in my entire life, my parents lowered their voices and truly, genuinely begged. They did not ask about the business investments anymore. They did not mention family loyalty or the sacred importance of coming together during hard times. Evelyn stumbled forward, her hands shaking uncontrollably, pleading with me not to confirm the fraud with the bank investigator. Grant stood beside her, his head bowed in absolute shame, asking me to please keep the notarized affidavit sealed inside the black binder. They begged me not to let the legal authorities take over, terrified of the impending prison sentences and the total, inescapable public ruin waiting for them on Monday morning. This was the true, singular reason they had sent that sweet, affectionate text message inviting me home. It was never about missing their estranged daughter or celebrating the purchase of my new industrial loft. It was a desperate, highly calculated trap designed to forcefully extract my compliance and secure my absolute silence before the federal jaws snapped completely shut on their own necks. I stood up slowly from the dining table. The chaotic, vibrating energy of the room immediately funneled toward me, but I did not absorb any of it. The polished wooden floorboards were completely littered with shredded napkins and the heavy, undeniable wreckage of a multi-year deception. Evelyn was still gasping for air, her eyes darting frantically across the faces of the stunned neighbors, but I knew the exact words to stop her heart completely. "The notarized affidavit denying my signature is not sitting inside this binder," I said, my voice cutting through the humid, garlic-scented air with absolute, surgical precision. "It was fully executed and stamped on Friday afternoon. It is currently locked inside a secure vault at my attorney's office in downtown Minneapolis. And his strict, irrevocable instructions are to file it directly with the Federal Banking Commission at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning." Evelyn physically collapsed inward. The regal, suffering matriarch, who had commanded the head of the table just an hour earlier, was entirely gone. In her place stood a terrified, cornered woman staring directly down the barrel of a severe federal wire fraud indictment. She completely lost her voice of moral authority. She did not ask for my forgiveness. She did not offer a tearful apology for abandoning me on my graduation day, nor did she express a single ounce of regret for secretly jeopardizing my financial future. Instead, her voice dropped into a frantic, scraping whisper. She begged me to call the lawyer and stop the filing. She was begging for my absolute silence, pleading for me to keep her dark secret just one more time to save her own skin from the crushing weight of the justice system. Grant stepped forward and began to beg as well. His voice cracked, heavy tears spilling over his weathered, exhausted cheeks. but his plea hurt the room in a fundamentally different way. He was not an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. As he choked on his words, he finally understood that the ultimate price of his cowardly, lifelong silence was this exact, humiliating moment. He had spent decades choosing the path of least resistance, and now he was forced to desperately beg his youngest daughter to absorb a catastrophic financial and legal punishment just to shield him from the explosive fallout of his wife's actions. I did not scream. I did not hurl my crystal water glass against the floral wallpaper or flip the heavy oak table. I refused to give them the chaotic, emotional storm they so desperately wanted, an outburst they could later dismiss to the town as a hysterical, childish overreaction. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world and told them, with absolute, chilling clarity, that I was entirely done keeping their secrets. I would never lie to protect this family ever again. I would never allow my legal name to be laid down in the dirt like a sturdy bridge for other people to comfortably walk over. I reached into the front pocket of my black leather binder and pulled out one final, crisp stack of papers. I laid the document completely flat on the wooden surface, right next to the forged bank files. I offered them one single, exceptionally narrow path forward. It was a formal, legally binding admission of guilt drafted by my corporate attorney. It explicitly stipulated that both Evelyn and Grant acknowledged the unauthorized, fraudulent use of my legal identity. It mandated the immediate, permanent cessation of all financial demands or requests for assistance. But most importantly, it included a drafted letter of retraction, confessing to their prolonged, vicious smear campaign against my character. The contract dictated that they would be forced to sign and mail this exact confession to every single extended relative, neighbor, and church member they had ever lied to about me. "You both sign this document tonight," I stated. My eyes locked onto Evelyn, or the bank's fraud division takes the unredacted, unmodified file first thing on Monday morning. Evelyn physically recoiled from the paper as if it were burning hot. She tried to bargain, her eyes darting wildly around the dining room. She whispered fiercely that family matters should never, ever be aired out in public, that signing such a humiliating confession would completely destroy their respectable reputation in Belmere forever. But for the very first time in her deeply manipulative life, she had absolutely no audience left to play to. The local neighbors were already quietly backing away toward the front hallway, eager to escape the radioactive fallout. Pastor Miller looked physically sick, staring at his shoes. Even Mallory, the golden child, turned her back on her mother, crossing her arms tightly across her chest and staring out the dark window. My sister had finally realized that if she allowed our mother to continue ghostwriting the narrative of her life, nothing she ever accomplished would be real. Grant broke first. He picked up the heavy silver pen resting near the centerpiece, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel, and scrawled his signature on the bottom line. He pushed the paper toward his wife without looking at her. Evelyn stared at the stark black ink for a long, agonizing minute. The entire room watched her breathe. Finally, she picked up the pen and signed her name last. She did not sign it out of deep, maternal remorse or a sudden awakening of conscience. She signed it because I had systematically, ruthlessly barricaded every single escape route she had ever relied upon. That precise moment, watching the wet ink dry on the heavy paper under the dining room chandelier, was the purest, most potent form of retribution I could have ever asked for. The woman who had spent her entire adult life gleefully dictating false narratives for everyone else was finally forced, in front of her entire curated community, to sign her name to the cold, undeniable truth drafted entirely by her victim. I closed the binder, picked it up, and walked out the front door into the freezing night air. I did not stay for tearful goodbyes or forced hugs. The next morning, I drove back up the long interstate toward Minneapolis. I still instructed my attorney to submit the necessary internal banking documents to legally sever my financial liability from Goldfinch gatherings. I did not pursue aggressive criminal charges, entirely refusing to engage in a messy, drawn-out, emotional prosecution, but I absolutely did not retract the mandatory financial consequences of their actions. My sister's luxury event business immediately entered a severe, very real liquidity crisis without my stolen credit score holding it up. The immaculate, wealthy mask of the Davis family had shattered into 1,000 unfixable pieces across the gossiping town of Belmere. Yet, as I gripped the steering wheel and watched the Missouri state line fade into the distance in my rearview mirror, I felt an unprecedented, profound sense of peace wash over my chest. It was not the hollow, bitter victory of destroying someone else's life. It was the quiet, unshakable serenity of finally refusing to be used as the buried foundation for someone else's crumbling house. When I finally walked into my sunlit industrial loft that evening, the very first thing I did was walk over to the exposed brick wall in my home office. I took the heavy, glass-framed college degree I had carried out of Belmere all those years ago and hung it securely on the wall. Right next to it, perfectly aligned, I framed the signed, notarized copy of the retraction letter my parents had been forced to execute. 7 years ago, they had intentionally left 2 front-row seats entirely empty, deciding that my proudest moment was not worth their precious time. Now, they had been forced to bow their heads in a room full of people and desperately beg for something I no longer owed them. My parents genuinely thought that, 7 years later, they would easily be begging for a signature to save the entire family, but in the end, the only thing they were forced to beg for was my silence. And for the very first time in my life, I refused to give it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where in the world you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.